Hi, good afternoon, SACAC. Hope you're all well. Thank you so much for taking time out of your lunch hour to learn a little bit and spend some time with some real experts in data and predictive modeling. It's a busy time of year in college counseling offices and especially in admission offices as offers of admission are out and schools wait with bated breath to see what comes back. We've got a couple of great experts today that'll walk us through some, at least one university's use of data and predictive modeling to build their recruitment and yield models. So that's where we'll spend most of our time today. If you have a question at any point, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll be taking questions and hopefully answering them throughout the presentation today. And then if you have a technical issue of any kind, feel free to chat the panelists in the chat function of the platform you're using. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists, David Trott and Jeff McLaughlin, to join us. Jeff, you want to take it away?
Yes, sorry, it took a moment for the video to catch up, so I'm happy to. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jeff McLaughlin. I'm the Executive Vice President of Data, Strategy, and Analytics at Fire Engine Red. And the brief sentence about Fire Engine Red is we're a 14, 15-year-old company now who works only with higher education. And my particular role is helping develop strategies around search. So identifying students who are most likely to attend a particular institution or meet an institutional's goals. And that's what I'll actually walk through today is how we put that together with William & Mary to help them achieve their enrollment success. And with that, I'll kick it over to you, David.
All right, great. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is David Trott. I'm one of the associate deans at William & Mary, which is a older than Fire Engine Red. We're 326 odd years old. Been in admissions since 1988, first at Gettysburg College, and moved to William & Mary in 1999, and spent a few years working in our IT department before we moved back to admissions. So I'm in charge of our marketing and communication program here.
Great. With that, we'll dive into the presentation. And I should have, we had our pictures, but of course we're on video, so you actually got to see us live. And we'll go through the goals today. So goal number one is provide just an introduction to predictive modeling. There's a lot of different models that institutions will employ at different phases in the enrollment cycle. So for example, now in April, many institutions have deployed their financial aid modeling. That's deep in the enrollment funnel. What we'll talk about today is the early steps. So as students emerge in College Board and ACT, NRCCA, some other sources, as those students put themselves kind of in front of colleges, how do we go about finding the right students for the right institution? A really topical thing, when we put this together a couple months ago, I had not yet heard the word psychodemographics, and now with Cambridge Analytics and all the messiness there, we had this on before about talking about potential concerns about student data, but treating students carefully and their information ethically is a key part of doing this well, and we'll address that too. Obviously, we want to see some outcomes. Predictive modeling is not free, so as we deploy it, what happens? What's the result of a thoughtful and efficient approach? And I talked about this a moment ago. And then last but not least, which data sources are out there. There's an enormous amount of information that people can get a hold of, whether from the Census Bureau or Wiki or PRISM clusters, you name it. How do we utilize relevant sources and make sure that we're doing this efficiently and effectively? And last but not least, how do we evaluate results? What should happen at the end of a well-applied model, both for individual students, but also for an institution like William & Mary? So with that, I'll kick it over to David about William & Mary.
Yeah, just a little brief history about who we are. Obviously, not everybody is familiar with William & Mary. We have sort of a small private college name. Our official name is the College of William & Mary in Virginia, but we are in fact a medium-sized public institution, public university. So obviously, we've been around since 1693. We didn't actually become a public school in Virginia until 1906. So we obviously have some name recognition issues, try to get our name out there and get everybody to have an understanding about who we are and what we're all about. So we obviously have a mix of in-state recruitment, versus out-of-state recruitment and the different messages. And so obviously our plans are to work with Fire Engine Ren to maximize our resources to bring in the best class that we can, given the resources that we have available to us. So that's what we've been trying to manage with them. We're obviously going to try to hit everything we can in terms of search and other things within Virginia, but out of state we have to be more selective, and that's where Jeff and his colleagues have been helping us.
Right. So as we dive into modeling in general, the starting point is always past data, because the biggest part of a model is to look backwards and tease out the patterns, things which have happened in the past, and then utilize those for efficiency and for benefit going forward. One thing that's just really, really key about this, and particularly in light of the current Facebook issues, that data is data's really good at predicting behavior in the aggregate, but both for privacy reasons, but also just for statistical reasons, it's almost impossible to know what an individual student or family will do. And we've all seen, I spent 15 years on the admission side and in offices, and we always had those anxiety moments on April 30th, wondering what an individual family might be talking around the dinner table about and how we might have not affected that appropriately. And on an aggregate basis, well, remember this, for better or for worse, this is not a bad prediction, even though it turned out not to be true on that particular November day. And many of you know 538.com, Nate Silver, who's a very thoughtful, very, very skilled strategist and statistical modeler. And this model, people said, oh, the model failed. It didn't necessarily fail, because what it says is if you held the election 4 times, Hillary Clinton would have won 3 times. And it just happened to be that the one of 4 times that it went the other way happened that day. So even the best modelers out there, even with an enormous amount of data, any individual outcome is really difficult to predict. To Nate Silver's credit, this is still live on their website, which I think is the sign of a really thoughtful and really honest strategic approach or statistical approach. And that sometimes when you get it wrong, you have to fess up and keep your results out there so you know how to evaluate moving forward. Mentioned this earlier, but ethical considerations, particularly in higher education, we're working, the vast majority of people with whom we're working are minors, and they deserve our care and respect. It's been great partnering with William & Mary, because they've obviously got enrollment goals, which are important, and some stresses that are on any admissions office. But every time we have conversations with them, it's always about how do we approach the right students in the right fashion. We also have to be careful, given the digital divide, given extraordinary gaps in income and family background, that we're leveraging models for efficiency but not exclusion. And that means that we should, as best we can, not try to recruit students who either have no chance of enrollment or really have no interest in looking at a particular institution. But we shouldn't forget those students who might not know about a great place like William & Mary, and how do we put the right message in front of them to generate new interest and make sure we're being expansive in our thoughts about education. I touched on this a moment ago. I think it's ethically important and appropriate to only reach out to students who have a reasonable chance of being admitted. It's fairly easy for a place like William & Mary, for example, which is pretty selective. If we wanted to go find a bunch of students and search, that is, send mail to a bunch of students who are not admissible, we could get a great response rate and we could drive up their applicant pool. That's not good for students. It's not good for the institution. So we always keep focused on who's likely to be admitted, or at least have a fighting chance of being admitted. And lastly, back to that notion about exclusion, we want to make sure we're reaching out to underrepresented students so that we're not simply just turning the crank and doing the exact same thing year after year, but we're being really thoughtful about expanding opportunities for students. And last but not least, along with that is the digital divide, that not every student has access to every resource. So making sure we're approaching them, if they don't have an email address, for example, make sure we're getting a print piece to them so that we're still in front of those students. David, could you talk through some of the really specific William & Mary goals?
Sure, yeah, and obviously Jeff was talking a little bit about that in terms of what we're looking for. Again, and to reiterate, we're not simply just trying to up our number of applicants. We are trying to reach a lot of different groups. I think we all have, everybody wants more of X, Y, and Z type of student in their pool, and that's really what we're trying to do. We are a Virginia-focused institution in terms of where and how we recruit. We have limited staff and resources to recruit out of state, so that if you were to look at where we tend to go beyond Virginia, it's really mainly the East Coast, from New England down to Atlanta. But we have a lot of markets where we just can't get every year. The state of Virginia is not going to say, hey, go spend 3 weeks recruiting in California. We just don't do that. We don't get to Florida every year. We don't get to Texas every year. Sometimes the only time we can get to a certain state is because an alum donates money so that we can get there. So there's a lot of markets we see potential for growth, but we can't get there physically. So we're looking at obviously picking the right group of students, working with Fire Engine Red to try to maximize our dollars. So we can, in some cases, follow up search with travel and other programming, but in many parts of the United States, it's relying almost completely on our search process.
So what data do we use to help them achieve those goals? And the first I mentioned earlier that the future we always predict using past data, and William & Mary has a terrific set of data. It's both accurate and comprehensive. We see a variety of data or quality of data sets coming in from clients. Sometimes there are big shifts in an institution. Sometimes it's just inaccurate, and sometimes there have been changes in institutional priorities. But for William & Mary, I was going to say, well, Fire Engine Red lucked out. William & Mary did some work to get this done correctly for us. So we had a lot of rich data to look at. We also drew primarily from College Board and ACT in terms of finding students for William & Mary to communicate with. The tests are obviously not a flawless tool. There are plenty of bright students and successful students who are not terrific test takers. But back to that notion of trying to keep William & Mary's focus on students who are likely to be admitted, it's our best shot at this point. And I want to add one important thing, which Dave will come back to as well. If a student emerges at William & Mary from beyond search, that's a great thing. That's not a failed search. But if a student with a lower test score or from a place that we didn't search shows up on campus or shows up in their database, they're still going to recruit and work with that student. So it's not, this is not a refinement or a process that says we're not going to work with anyone who doesn't come off of these list sources. It's more of a, how do we go introduce ourselves to more students early? College Board and ACT also have really important protections for students. And some of you have undoubtedly dealt with students who've had their name picked up by a place that doesn't have those protections. So as an example, Fire Engine Red does not ever technically own the name of a student. From these two sources, we license the data on behalf of our clients. So it's a College Board name that they own, that William & Mary licenses, and we communicate to those students. That's important because I sign, for every client every year, a statement of good practices, equivalent document for College Board and ACT both, which says we're not going to send credit card mailings, we're not going to send anything that's not really focused on encouraging them to look at colleges. So I think that's really important. We also get quality data because they check it. So when we get an accurate address, we get an accurate email address 99 times out of 100. So that we're not wasting William & Mary's money chasing after students who don't live at that same place anymore, or don't have an accurate email address. And last but not least, I mentioned this earlier, that the academic assessment, not perfect, not flawless, but it gives us something to go on in terms of suggesting a student might be admissible down the road. We also leverage some supplemental data for William & Mary. One of the sources which you'll hear a lot about, which Fire Engine Red has stayed away from, is PRISM clusters. In a previous career, I spent some time working at a marketing firm which worked with commercial interests, and this is a great tool for commercial interests. If you get a raise, you move to a new place, and suddenly you see that you're getting different mail, it's because PRISM clusters is really good at identifying who's likely to buy a BMW versus who's likely to buy a Prism, for example, or a Prius, for example. But it's got some flaws, and this arrived at a perfect time. This mailing came to my almost 9-year-old son. It's got his name on it. It's a nice piece. It's got some apparently friendly people enjoying a glass of wine out of doors, except, as I mentioned, he's 9 years old, and this is what they sent to that kid. It was an advertisement for an advanced insurance/retirement planning thing which I hope Will gets to in the late 2050s, but he's not interested right now. That came out of PRISM data because that kid with his tongue sticking out had a health issue when he was young and has a pacemaker. So I'm sure someone looked at that and said, okay, everyone who's got a pacemaker is 55 or up, but that's not true. So that's one of the reasons we stick with College Board and ACT and some other data sources, because we've got confidence that we're not going to send pacemaker advertisements to a 9-year-old. We also leverage College Board segment analysis service. And we all know the enormous amount of information the College Board has at their fingertips. Every student who takes a PSAT or an SAT or an AP test, students who fill out the College Board's financial aid forms, all that data is collected by them. They pull that together into a tool called Segment Analysis Service and can tease out a lot of information. So for example, the student likelihood of attending a private institution. From different high schools in different neighborhoods, where do students send their test scores, which is an early indication of where they might end up applying. What types of institutions do they look at? How selective are the institutions that students from individual high schools will look at? And we all know those elite private institutions, private high schools, which will send a disproportionate number of students off to more elite institutions. Same thing with some big urban public high schools that are less likely to do that. Strength of high school curriculum is also important, because as we're trying to assess the likelihood of not just admission, but also enrollment and retention, we want to make sure we're getting the right students in front of the right institutions for long-term success. And last but not least, something which we leveraged a lot for William and Mary is a likelihood of student mobility. Is this a young person who is likely to drive a long way? David mentioned, for example, they don't get to California. It would be inappropriate or / inefficient to reach out to students who don't really have any indication that they're going to leave the state or leave the West Coast. So we want to make sure that we're focusing William and Mary's resources on those students who've got the possibility of actually coming east for college in that case. Some factors we used for William and Mary in particular. We also looked at self-reported grades, which are obviously key. Students tend to be pretty honest about these. There's always a little anxiety about this. They will sometimes be slightly more, I wouldn't call it a fib, but slightly more optimistic than maybe they might be. So sometimes a B, what we would call a B+ student, will show up as an A- student, but very few students, I think, really abuse that system. We do use the test scores.
And Jeff,
go ahead.
What is it now in terms of the percent of students who report an A- or better average? That keeps going up and up.
It does go up. I think I saw a statistic last fall before NACAC that now half of the students in the country have a 3.0 or better GPA, which is a perfect segue into test scores, because as a place like William & Mary is trying to sift through the differences between a 3.5 and a 3.6 GPA, test scores, well, and David, you should speak to this, but I think they become more important, and we end up looking at them earlier than we'd like.
Yeah, I think as we've worked on, it's that finding that right combination, right? This GPA and these test score ranges, and coming up with a lot of different models for the various areas and groups that we're looking at. So that's obviously a big part of what we spend our time on, trying to figure out which list is the best list to get with. We pay attention particularly further away to which high school a student attends. And when I say I pay attention to, that can go both ways. And you'll see David will have a chance to talk through some of the messaging we send out. There are really terrific students who attend high schools that send very few students off to college. There are average students who go to 10 high schools that send a lot of students off to college. Helping sift out between those two and figuring out what messaging needs to go, particularly on a financial aid side when we encourage disadvantaged students to move deeper into the college world. That can be a really key factor as well. That strength of high school curriculum, which is on the last page, also comes into play. When we get further and further afield for William & Mary, we spend more and more attention on that and worrying about that, because it's pretty fairly correlated to mobility. The stronger a high school, the more likely a student is to travel. And then last but not least, the student's home address and their likelihood of actually leaving. So home address is an interesting thing to look at. There are differences between affluence and mobility and interest in paying for college. I live in Northfield, Minnesota. You can probably see the white glare over my shoulder, which is coming off of snow, which is miserable. Northfield is a town which is above average affluence, but extraordinarily likely to send students out of state because they're two small private colleges in town. So it's the notion we get students to go farther away.
There's a town about 10 miles away from here which has equivalent affluence, which sends almost everyone inside the state of Minnesota. So that home address can come into play as well as we're looking to recruit out of state for a place like William and Mary. There are, mostly for good, an extraordinary number of unknowns. We don't know a student's specific grades. We don't know their specific test scores. We don't know their family income. We don't necessarily know their family educational background. Sometimes you get hint on the last one. And a question just came through, the segment analysis, is this student level data? No and yes. It's no at the point when we purchase names because of those ethical considerations that College Board and ACT put into place. So we cannot go out and do like Cambridge Analytica did and say, give us these 5 students and we're going to influence them in this really particular way. What we can say is, are these students, do they fall into some general ranges from that family address and from the high school and from the test scores and grades and so forth. So it's a great question. We can apply segment analysis service after we have names in hand, and then you get a little more clarity for that data, but still nothing so specific. But when they apply or when the student sends their test scores off to David and William and Mary admissions folks, they'll have more data than Fire Engine Red will. And I think that's appropriate. We're supposed to be modeling in general. They're supposed to be dealing with students on a one-on-one basis and counseling them. So I think that it works well to have those protections in place. So what does this look like? North Carolina is obviously close to Virginia, so it's that regional area. This can look a little messy. One of the things that one of the limitations we've got, and this gets back to the notion that we cannot cherry pick individual students. We have to look at things on a more aggregate basis. Zip code is the smallest level or the most refined geographic level that we can purchase. So we put a couple of models in place for William and Mary, and you'll see the kind of the color coding. So places in blue are places that William and Mary has done well over the course of time. So it's kind of a steady pipeline. They get students from the greater Chapel Hill area, for example, and around Charlotte, Asheville. And then some other places, the national Tier 1 and Tier 2, the green, are places where they maybe have had a little interest, but not a lot of interest, but have geodemographics that look like places that should, or look like places where students who should be interested in William and Mary might come from. And it's a little hidden on this slide, but there's a little, it's right over Asheville, there's the yellow zip code. One of William and Mary's focuses is building a diverse student body. And we applied a third level modeling on top to say, are there places that maybe William and Mary hasn't done particularly well and geodemographically don't look as promising, but have those students who they want to diversify their campus? And the answer is yes. North Carolina was less yellow than some other places, but that was one of the areas we moved in. And again, and David, you can speak a little more to this, because we were laughing when we looked at Goldsboro, for example, which is not being purchased. But if a student from Goldsboro inquires at William and Mary.
Yeah, obviously what would happen, and we'll talk a little bit about assessment later on, but clearly if pockets develop, that becomes part of our historical model, right, over time. And so that's going to affect your for future purchases. But yeah, we're not, again, with our resources, able to buy or license every name from every state. So this is how we can segment, but definitely are able to build pockets, either with obviously people finding us, but then us following up with, particularly in this area of North Carolina, where we may be able to follow up with the travel program or something of that sort. Yeah. And I think the other point, Jeff, that we talked about earlier is that this doesn't mean that we're not recruiting underrepresented students within these non-yellow areas, that they're included in the other colored areas, the green and the blue, and as well. So,
right. So David and Tim, who we also work with at William & Mary, have the running joke, which is they know they're going to get enrollment from North Carolina, so that's an easy one for Fire Engine Red.
Right.
But tell us about the Dakotas. So we do have a model which went out to the Dakotas. You get some sense for the difference in region. If you look at that zip code in the far southwest of South Dakota, that's a zip code that is the shape and potentially even the size of Delaware. I mean, it's an enormous area. There aren't that many students out there. So this was part of that national region too, because these are places where students are likely to leave or have proven likely to leave the state, even though they haven't yet made their way to William and Mary. So many of you know, one of the South Dakota state institutions is in Watertown. Fargo is a recipient of the North Dakota oil boom. And Sioux Falls has a really burgeoning financial center. So there are students who are going to look outside of those states to go to college, and William and Mary ought to be on their radar. And so we license some names and put it on their radar for them.
That's our dean's #1 goal. Not really, actually, but enrolling a student from North Dakota.
And we've joked I'm only 3 hours away, so I might have to drive across to Sioux Falls and wave a flag.
Jeff has our permission to recruit for William and Mary in North Dakota.
So many of you have heard about the WICHE. Well, I assume maybe you've heard about the WICHE data. This is the consortium of institutions in the western part of the country, and they do a terrific job of pulling together demographic projections. One caveat about their projections: these were all done before the most recent election, and I worry about some shifts, particularly with Latino students, in terms of the 10 and 15 years out. But in general, they have done a really great job of projecting what's going to happen down the road. There's a couple things on here which I think are key. One is you look at the challenge for William and Mary in finding a couple of students. There are just not that many students in these two states. They're not as mobile as a place like Minneapolis, St. Paul, or the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. So it's a tough challenge. The other stat which is important here is on occasion we'll talk to a president or a board and we'll say, well, they'll say North Dakota is growing dramatically, and you say, yes, it's growing 33% over the next 10 years. But it's a small N, so there are not that many more students. And even Mississippi, a state which many of you might be more familiar with, even with a decline in projected population in Mississippi, there's still going to be more kids in Mississippi going off to college than in the Dakotas combined. So making sure that we're paying attention to all the patterns and not just a single number is an important part of this growth as well. That WICHE data, by the way, is even if you're at an institution which is not, and even if you're not at a college, if you're not in those areas, that's still publicly available. So that link at the bottom, or you can just Google WICHE data. You can find that information. It's a lot, and it can be overwhelming, but it's available for anyone to dive into. So we've got the names in hand that we think are going to meet William and Mary's criteria, and then David, I'll let you talk about what do we do with them.
Sure. I think we've always been among those colleges that find that an electronic communication process works best in combination with some print media. So that's what we've come up with Fire Engine Red, and obviously the other benefit of having them work with us as we deal with sophomores and juniors is that they're able to spend time communicating or helping us communicate with them and handling all that process during a really, really busy time of the year when we don't have the resources to focus on that. So that's something that's been extremely helpful for us, as I'm sure it has been for many of you other colleges out there. But obviously we want our messaging to match up with our modeling as much as possible. And when we talk about the various groups that we've selected, we can't have, we don't do such defined messaging that each group gets a separate message, but over the series of messages that we send, we're trying to highlight all the various issues that will hit all of those students. So that's where, again, something like having messages on cost certainly is important, and the diversity of our student body, things of that sort, introducing them to the academic and non-academic programs. So we do have a big series of emails, and here's some samples of the emails that we've been sending. And then we do have 2 print pieces that are combined with this process. We're also, and Jeff's group's been great with this, been collecting information on parent email so that we can do messaging to those. And this is basically only for those people who volunteer to give us their parent information. So that's what we've been doing.
We're getting closer to the end, so if you're getting bored, hang with us a little bit. But, so there's several layers of assessment we'll do. And this kind of follows, this absolutely follows the admissions sequence. And the first is who actually inquired. So we are reaching out to students and saying, we think you're the type of student who would be interested in William and Mary. We think we've made a compelling case with some messaging. did they actually raise their hand? And so that first level, that's the first thing we watch and measure. The secondary one is who's actually opening and clicking messages, but not saying they want to inquire yet. And when I came back from the college side to Fire Engine Red, I was pretty skeptical of this because I thought, I'm old enough that I remember when you had to inquire, you had to fill out a card or see someone at the college fair. So I was skeptical about this because I thought it's not interest. But as we measure it, I think students are very thoughtful about where they officially want more information and how they interact with colleges in a way that perhaps they weren't when email first arrived. So we do see that students who open multiple messages and click through multiple messages do still end up applying it at disproportionately high rates. But we also clarify for William and Mary, what's the difference? Who are the students who really ask for more information? Who are the students who are kind of subtly expressing more interest as well? We also bounce these against William and Mary's historical benchmarks. So as we've moved into those new areas, are we getting enough interest? Is it worth it to continue to go to those zip codes in North Dakota? Are we targeting the right places in California with the right messaging to ensure that students are actually paying attention? So we'll watch that. And then for us, because we've got about 59 or 60 clients around the country, some selected, some not, we'll look to see how William & Mary is performing against the overall historical our benchmarks as well to make sure that we're doing the right thing and look for any tweaks. But that's only the short-term assessment. The longer-term assessment is something which David and his team will really be honed in on.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, we're hoping to generate applicants. Again, as we talked about earlier, it's literally not just to get numbers of unqualified students. We're really trying to maintain our status and increase our status as a national university. So again, trying to get those qualified students from additional markets to help build our base as best we can. So that's really what we're looking at in terms of, hey, are we making inroads into these areas that we're really hoping to increase visibility and applications. We feel really confident that we get solid applicants. We know they're going to graduate and perform well. So, we feel comfortable with our process. Retention has been, a really strong area for us. Our graduation rates are, well into the 90s. So again, it's just, hey, can we really break into those areas where we really can't get to necessarily on our own? So we're very excited about, following this process over the next several years.
And back to the ethical concerns I brought up earlier, we've touched on earlier, we are not doing a good job as William & Mary's partner in this unless we are delivering students to them who can be admitted and who will be successful long-term. It's fairly easy to get students to do things which look like interest. It's much harder to begin that relationship with an institution. So that's always our goal. Two questions have come in, and I'll jump on both of those. The first was how many students or measures, do you have measurements about how students are using email? And two things about that. Yes, it's something we pay a lot of attention to because we want to know how effective messages are and if it's interacting well with a given student. David, you'll be able to address the question about how that affects the judgment of a student's interest.
Sure. Yeah. We're not so deep into it that it's something that we focus on necessarily in an individual level, but certainly we do track our email read rates and things of that sort. So, again, as we do our messaging and obviously you've got a combination of students who haven't been a part of our search process and then students who are a part of the search process, but we're still messaging them in a similar way and are able to track, what are the read rates and we can look and see that, the kids that tend to enroll obviously tend to read more of your emails, right? I don't think that's a surprise for anybody. But we don't say that because a kid hasn't read our emails that they're less qualified or less interested in us. I think for many of you, if you're like me, you might have had boys who went through the application process and really hardly read any emails, but they still had schools they were interested in. So we try to balance that and not overread into things as much as possible. We are trying to refine our messages and continue to make those stronger so that our read rates go up, our click-through rates can go up, and that's really just going to help overall make a stronger pool for us.
But I hope I saw your message come in and I kind of half chuckled that most of your kids don't use email anymore. That's I believe you, and we've seen changes in how students engage with email. And to one of the an additional piece of information go along with what David said. I laughed at the boys because I was one of those boys.
Yeah, right.
But also, we're talking about students who we may begin communicating with when they're as young as 15, and we all know the enormous changes that we all go through between the ages of 15 and 18. So over measuring early interests can be problematic because kids change their mind. So some of those emails come back and take a look, or some students come back and take a look at emails that are 2 or 3 years old. It's interesting to watch the data come through for us for campaigns which have been long finished. So it's an interesting artifact that's out there. Oh, the question about how do we determine strength of curriculum. So Fire Engine Red doesn't, the College Board does, and I don't know the answer to that question in terms of strength of curriculum. I assume, for better or for worse, that it looks at the number of APs offered and potentially correlation with test scores. But it's a good question. I don't know. High school profile, that is something that we won't see at the Fire Engine Red side. But again, David, I assume that's something at the point of application that you all.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. But I think you're right. I think a lot of it is correlated to AP, number of APs offered and things of that sort.
The other question that came through is, will a PowerPoint be available to participants at the end of this? PowerPoint, no, but there's a link that'll come from SACAC to allow you to see this again. So you'll get the data back, yes, or the information again.
All right, SACAC, any other questions for our presenters today? We'll let those filter in for just a second, gentlemen.
No problem.
Oh, and one last question. Well, two things. One, before I forget, we've got our email addresses out here. Don't hesitate to email with questions at all. You can certainly find Fire Engine Red online, and I know you can find William & Mary online if you want more information about either organization. The marketing and feeding of the admissions funnel, I love that phrase, feeding. When we started, that's Fire Engine Red's area of expertise is at the top end. And I'll let David answer the question about indices with admissions decisions, because that's past our work, I think.
Right. And we are, for better or for worse, a holistic review institution. So we do not do any indices in terms of, hey, this student's more likely to enroll based on X, Y, or Z factors. We basically start every applicant and read them the same way.
Boy, a lot of great questions coming in into two different ways. I'll answer the Alini's question first. The questions on the SAT and PSAT registration, the more data we have, the better. And there was a decline in the amount of data that students were providing to the College Board a couple of years ago, but that seems to have come back. And many of you know this, the ACT asks roughly equivalent questions. Because we can look, or because College Board can look at patterns from a high school, and then we can look with our data and with some College Board data at patterns from individual neighborhoods, even if we don't get a lot of that additional information, we can still make some pretty good assumptions about how students might behave deeper in the college search. And I want to make sure we're not over-promising on either end of the scale. We certainly can't look at an individual student and say, we know that student is actually going to William & Mary. We also can't look at a student and say that student's never going to William & Mary. So we're trying to operate in the middle there of who's likely to be receptive to a message. So again, the more data we've got, the better we can assess that likelihood. But because we're talking about younger students who typically follow similar patterns as people around them, whether it's their neighborhood or their high school, we can do a fair amount with a fairly small amount of information. David, I think there's a question for you about regional admissions reps. So.
Yeah, I don't see that question. Let me look back on the...
Oh, it's down in the panelists.
Oh, in the panelist section. Oh, there we go. So the question is, will you still have your regional admissions rep visiting our schools to see where our students are coming from? And then that will connect with your work. So if I fully understand the question, again, our regional reps will go to areas that have been of historic strength to us, basically within the East Coast area. It's still obviously something, again, where we hope we can follow up in more areas. You can imagine that if we are successful breaking into some markets, we will do our best to try to find the resources to get there. Yeah, that's just unfortunately not going to be able to get to all the markets that we would love to get to.
Abby asked a question about what advice do we give to people who want to jump into this. At the risk of sounding like I have an enormous ego, which I hope I don't. I was an English major. I started as an admissions counselor because I didn't know what else I was going to do with my career, and that seemed like an interesting thing to do at my alma mater for a couple of years. And my then boss came to me and said, we're putting a CRM in place. You know how to use Excel. You're the guy. And I should point out that what I knew how to use Excel to do was to sort a list of tour guides. So yeah, data, but not much more than that. I think there's it was easier in the mid-90s because there was less data. So it was easier to kind of get in the shallow end and learn how to swim. I think it's harder now because there's so much more data. There are a number of really good online tutorials about how to get data cleaned. And I think that's a key part of this, is if you can get your information in a standard format, you can start to look at patterns. Access remains a terrific tool for beginners. It's a Microsoft tool. Many of you will have it as part of the Office suite. It can do some things differently and better than Excel because it holds data together in ways that Excel doesn't. And at the risk of sounding like I don't know how, like you might wonder how I got my job. I learned a lot from Access for Dummies in the mid-90s, late 90s. Those are not bad books to jump into and see how to do some basic things. The other great thing about data is you can be fearless. You can keep copies of everything. You can try whatever you want. You can back test if you've got a couple of years information, which we do all the time when we're making models. So I just keep trying and experimenting until you get comfortable and familiar with it. And I wouldn't be afraid if you don't have a statistical background, because a lot of this is the ability to take the information and put it into a story that makes sense. Boy, lots of questions. A couple of questions about demonstrated interest. I'll answer on the search side, David, and then to you.
Sure.
So on the search side, when we look to license names for a place like William & Mary, we don't know any demonstrated interest yet. So we're, in one sense, trying to generate that from students. Certainly, as we turn information over to William & Mary, we're turning information to those students who are most interested, which is appropriate because that's who you want in your inquiry pool. David, I think you can take it from there about what happens deeper in the cycle.
Yeah. So, and sorry, I'm trying to answer questions on both sides at the moment. So in terms of demonstrated interest, again, if we can't get to that area, we still take our regional dean responsibility extremely seriously, and we try to be as helpful as we can to any students from our areas. So students can feel free to contact us. We list on our website, hey, here's the regional dean for X, Y, and Z area, and students should not hesitate to make themselves be known to the regional dean. That's an easy way to, in a sense, get an ally in the process. We clearly love to see students visit campus. We know that's not a financial reality for everybody, but again, those emails or phone calls to regional deans can certainly help in the process.
So two other questions I think kind of aimed at my direction. The first one is a follow-up question about which data sources. Abby, and I'm sorry, I misread your question earlier. Institutional data is still the best place to start because it'll be the data you'll be most familiar with, and you can tease a lot of patterns out there. And particularly if you're looking at travel modeling, obviously tying where you have traveled in the past, whether it's by seed code or by zip code, to see where you've spent time in the past, and then bounce that against where you're actually seeing applicants and enrolled students. That is a relatively simple but relatively valuable thing to do. So I'd start with your own institutional data. diving into College Board segment analysis clusters or Wikidata is more broad strokes, so that can help you if you're looking nationwide. Those can get complicated in a real hurry, but a lot of the value that you can provide is with the data you've already got in-house. And as you figure that out, you'll know where to go look next to think, I don't know X, Y, or Z. And oftentimes it's a simple Google search to go find where that data might be. At the risk of being overcautious, make sure it's from a credible source. There's good data and there's bad data out there. So Census Bureau you can trust. Some other ones I think I'd be more skeptical about.
Yeah, and just to add in on that, Jeff, is organizations like SACAC are great places to go to conferences and obviously network with your colleagues. One of the fun things I think we all enjoy about admission is the congeniality and the data sharing, the information sharing. So if you're new into this, working with or attending conferences like SACAC are invaluable resources.
A couple more. Thanks for the questions. This is great. Can high schools know how we're being rated by various schools? That's a tough one. The information that the College Board uses as part of the segment analysis clusters is typically information if you're at a school that you will know better than we will. So the percentage of students who go on to a private institution or public institution, percentage of students who go farther afield. If you've got a religious affiliation, it's not relevant to William & Mary, but we work with some Catholic institutions, and it's probably not a great surprise to you that Jesuit high schools send an extraordinary number of students on to Catholic institutions. So things like that are easily known and relatively predictable. One of the values of the College Board's data is none of us can know all the information for all 40-odd thousand high schools in the country. So being able to look for William & Mary at which institutions in California send more students back to the East Coast, that's something I would never know off the top of my head, but the College Board data can pull together. So I think if you're at an institution and you know your own information, you can probably guess pretty accurately how we're looking at that information as well. It's not granular enough, I think, to be scary, but more granular enough to be really, really useful, I suppose. So the other question, does a student's response to marketing efforts influence admissions decisions from the holistic side? Or are the marketing efforts mainly measured in terms of increasing qualified applicants? Dave, if you're okay, I'll reverse that and answer the second half first, which is, yes, from Farmington Red's standpoint, since it's our charge to help drive qualified students to William & Mary, we'll pay a lot of attention to that. And David's earlier comment about new areas, so if organic interest emerges or there are demographic shifts that we'll pick up with modeling, we'll adjust our models to respond to that and make sure we're trying to stay a step ahead for William & Mary. But David, I'll leave you the harder one about the holistic review. But.
Yeah, so for us, demonstrated interest can be a factor for out-of-state students. So that's one of the ways we can obviously try to see who is more likely to enroll. Again, we don't do that for in-state students. And again, it's a very minor issue. So on some of the questionnaires where this is asked, if demonstrated issue is considered, yeah, we're just slightly into the yes. Needle has moved to slightly yes on that for out-of-state students. Again, it's not going to be obviously a huge factor for us.
All right, guys, thank you so much for SACAC for your questions, and Jeff and David for your time today. Really appreciate it. Like Jeff said, we're going to share a recording of this video on the SACAC webinars and presentations website. I'll put up a link to that, as well as links to email addresses for both David and Jeff if you all want to contact them. We'll leave that up while you filter out of the room. But guys, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for coming. Thanks,
Dave, thanks for getting us all set up. And David, thank you